Buenos días a todos. Good morning to everybody. Mi nombre es Fabio. Estamos iniciando el webinar. We're just starting this webinar. Por favor, seleccionen bajo la barra de herramientas el botón de interpretación simultánea el idioma de su preferencia. Please make sure to select on the toolbar down below your screen, the interpretation button, your selected language. We'll start shortly. Thank you. Buenos días a todos. Vamos a comenzar en unos minutos. Por favor, asegúrense de seleccionar el canal de su preferencia, el lenguaje de su preferencia en el botón de interpretación simultánea. Gracias. Buenos días. Vamos a empezar en unos minutos. Por favor, asegúrense de seleccionar el idioma de su preferencia en el botón de interpretación. Tiene la forma de un globo terráqueo, está en la barra de herramientas. Hello everybody, thank you for being here. Please make sure to select the language of your preference. We have simultaneous interpretation for this event. You can do that by clicking the interpretation button down below the toolbar. Thank you. We'll start shortly. Ok, buenos días a todos. Mi nombre es Fabio Salvatierra, soy el oficial de aeródromos y ayudas terrestres de la Oficina Regional Sudamericana de la OASI. Le damos la más cordial bienvenida a todos los participantes en este primer seminario virtual sobre servicio de escala o ground handling, preparado por la Oficina Regional de la OASI SAM, con el apoyo del proyecto RLA 06901 y el apoyo de varias organizaciones internacionales. A continuación, voy a pedirle a nuestro director regional, el señor Fabio Rabani, que nos brinde unas palabras de bienvenida. Fabio, ¿estás ahí?
Muchísimas gracias, Fabio. Muy buenos días a todos. ¿Me escuchan bien? Espero
Alto
que
y
sí.
claro, Fabio.
Perfecto. Ustedes verán que tendremos muchos Fabios en esta reunión. Y me presento como el director regional de la Oficina Sudamericana de la OASI y que estamos involucrados en varias actividades con nuestros estados y me alegro muchísimo de que tengamos una asistencia tan grande para este evento que demuestra no solamente el interés, sino el reconocimiento de la importancia del tema de los servicios de escala para la aviación. Y eso ha sido un tema que ha pasado mucho tiempo por discusiones, evaluaciones y modelos distintos de reglamentación, de control y de aplicación de esas reglas en diversos países de todo el mundo, no solamente de nuestra región, que también tiene una variedad muy grande de modelos de cómo se manejan, cómo se regulan los servicios de escala. Pero quisiera, antes de entrar en los detalles de este evento, comentar un poco lo que hemos visto y enfrentado con respecto a la pandemia que asola a todo el mundo y sin duda ninguna ha afectado enormemente los países de Sudamérica. Eso ha demostrado que primeramente hay sí una resiliencia del sector, pero el sector de aviación necesita tener lecciones aprendidas de este proceso de una manera que no se repitan algunos de los errores que hemos cometido y reconociendo que la preparación para acciones de naturaleza crítica como esta, como afecta esta pandemia, estén dentro de un manejo, de un abordaje sistémico por parte de los diversos actores del sector de aviación. Y eso exige que nosotros reconozcamos que varios de los estándares internacionales, de las guías establecidas por la OASI, tienen ese objetivo de garantizar que este abordaje sistémico permita la resiliencia. Y es por eso que alento a todos los estados la importancia, los representantes aquí presentes, que tengan en mente que todos los estándares que han sido discutidos y preparados a lo largo de todos esos años, muchas veces para enfrentar el crecimiento sostenido que la aviación estaba teniendo y volverá a tener, por supuesto, ahora son importantes también que estos estándares sean cumplidos para aumentar la eficiencia de los trabajos que son realizados por los estados. El concepto de gestión de la seguridad operacional, el SMS, el concepto del propio programa estatal de seguridad operacional son cruciales. No son cruciales solamente ahora para atender el crecimiento o las demandas exigentes en procesos de certificación y vigilancia de la seguridad operacional. Son cruciales para garantizar que los estados mismo con recursos limitados, mismo con limitaciones hoy de viajes, de realización de actividades presenciales, pueden realizar una gestión de la seguridad de manera efectiva. Y eso es parte de la discusión que parte en esta reunión, en este webinario. Por supuesto, el manual que ha sido brindado al mundo en 2019, trabajado directamente por los miembros del Ground Handling Task Force, la fuerza tarea que trabajó en el tema de servicios de escala, tenía en mente la importancia de poner las directrices básicas de cómo aplicar la gestión de la seguridad. Y si uno ve este manual, entiende que eso es parte de una discusión constante en varias áreas del sector de aviación. Y asimismo, es muy importante aprovechar este evento, que les comento que es el primer evento que la OASI promueve en este tema, tras de la pandemia, mismo así nos demoró un poco para lograr realizarlo, en coordinación con varias asociaciones a las cuales agradezco muchísimo a IVAC y ASA por esta colaboración. Tenemos en manos una oportunidad de oro de escuchar y entender lo que se preconiza en este documento y escuchar también las experiencias diversas que hemos tenido de nuestros países con respecto al manejo de la gestión de la seguridad y de la regulación de servicios de escala. Es una oportunidad de empezar una discusión de manera a atraer los temas técnicos, pero también de demostrar las lecciones aprendidas y cómo buscar medios de implementar las guías que han sido establecidas ahora por la OASI. La armonización en este tema es muy importante. La armonización, cuando hablamos, no es simplemente que se busque mantener las cosas iguales en todos los países, sino de generar la confianza de que hay un estándar establecido, que hay oportunidades de varios países beneficiarse de manera común a las guías y las reglas de seguridad que han sido establecidas y quizás facilitar que nuevos negocios sean expandidos por toda una región o por todo el mundo. Entonces, la idea ahora es buscar entender y ver los medios de aplicar las guías que están ahí establecidas en este documento que trata de los servicios de escala. Es una oportunidad. Espero que ustedes tengan en esta reunión la potestad de poder realizar sus preguntas y quizás participar en eventos futuros sobre el tema. Una vez más, me gustaría de agradecer muchísimo a todos los que han colaborado, todos los panelistas, a las asociaciones que han aportado y apoyado en este evento y, por supuesto, al Proyecto 06, que también apoya a la realización de este webinario. Muchísimas gracias a todos y que tengamos un excelente evento.
Muchísimas gracias, Fabio, por tus palabras y también agradecerte por el apoyo que has brindado a este programa y a la realización de este evento. Bueno, antes de empezar nuestro webinar, voy a presentarles algunas instrucciones o permítanme abrir acá una pequeña presentación para mostrarles un poco lo que vamos a esperar de este evento. Las presentaciones están en inglés, pero estoy hablando en idioma español. Por favor, asegúrense de utilizar la interpretación simultánea. El evento está planificado para 2 horas, de 9 a.m. hora de Lima hasta las 11 a.m. hora de Lima. Sin embargo, dependiendo del desarrollo del evento, podemos ajustar un poco el tiempo. Recuerden seleccionar el botón de interpretación simultánea para poder aprovechar en su idioma. Tenemos interpretación en inglés y español. Las presentaciones que se van a mostrar a continuación y una grabación de este evento va a estar disponible en la página web del evento. Aquí hicimos una versión corta de la dirección, pero si ingresan a la página web de la Oficina Regional Sudamericana de la OASI también pueden encontrar bajo la sección de eventos toda esta información. Para las preguntas, hemos habilitado el botón de preguntas y respuestas, que es un pequeño botón con 2 nubes que dice Q y A. Allí ustedes pueden hacer sus preguntas y les exhorto a que verifiquen también ese botón, porque algunas de las preguntas que ya otros participantes hayan hecho, ustedes pueden darle like para que esas preguntas, las preguntas que tengan, digamos, más likes, pueden ser las preguntas que abordemos al final del evento, si el tiempo así lo permite. No obstante, si el tiempo no lo permite, nos comprometemos a tomar las preguntas, pasarlas a los panelistas y presentar las respuestas en un documento que vamos a publicar en la página web del evento posteriormente. También, si no quieren usar el botón de Q&A o si quisieran hacer algunas preguntas luego del evento, pueden utilizar la dirección de correo electrónico de la oficina regional que está aquí mostrada. Sí les pedimos que por favor en el título del correo incluyan estas siglas para poder nosotros identificar internamente las preguntas. Al final del evento van a recibir, cuando termine el evento se les va a abrir una ventana en su explorador web con una pequeña encuesta. Les agradecemos por favor tomarla, es muy corta, son un par de preguntas que nos pueden servir mucho para la continuación de las actividades de la oficina con relación a este tema. Tenemos una agenda bastante interesante. Vamos a contar primero con las provisiones actuales de la OASI con referencia a ground handling o a los servicios a escala. Ahí tenemos la participación de uno de nuestros colegas de la sede de la OASI. Luego vamos a presentar un poco cómo llegamos a esta nueva guía que estamos presentando en este evento y el trabajo del grupo de tarea de servicios a escala o el Ground Handling Task Force, un grupo de tarea que contó con la participación de varias organizaciones internacionales reunidas en la sede de la OASI para trabajar en esta guía, que es la que exhortamos tanto a estados como a industria a adoptar. Luego vamos a contar con la perspectiva de dos estados de la región SAM, uno de ellos Brasil y Perú, a los cuales nuevamente quiero agradecer su participación en este evento. Luego vamos a tener la perspectiva de los proveedores de los servicios de escala o ground handlers por parte de ASA. Luego también la perspectiva de los operadores aeroportuarios por parte de ACI. La perspectiva de los operadores de aeronaves por parte de IATA y la perspectiva del segmento de aviación ejecutiva por parte de IPAC. Estas son digamos que las principales partes interesadas en la preparación de este documento. Y bueno, si bien existen muchas otras partes interesadas, digamos que estas son las que consideramos o invitamos para poder presentar sus puntos de vista. Nuevamente, recordarles que las presentaciones van a estar disponibles en este sitio web. Igual a través del sitio web de la Oficina Regional Sudamericana de la OASI pueden, a través de la sección de eventos y reuniones, pueden encontrar en la página web donde vamos a estar publicando estas presentaciones. Bueno, sin más, quería darle la palabra a nuestro colega R.C. Raman de nuestra sede de la OASI para que haga la primera presentación. R.C. Solo recuerda tomar el icono de interpretación y seleccionar inglés si no lo has hecho.
Thank you, Fabio. Could you see my screen?
Se ve perfectamente, R.C. Gracias.
Hello all. Hello all. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you, wherever you are from. I'm R.C. Raman, Technical Officer at the Aerodrome Operations and Infrastructure Session at ICAO Montreal office, basically responsible for the aerodrome operations, obstacle limitation surfaces, and heliport design and operations. I'm supporting the work of the Ground Handling Task Force. So this short presentation is going to be on the current provisions on ground handling from ICAO and specifically on the manual on ground handling. So to start with a bit of a background, ground handling has been a bit of a gray area for quite some time from a regulatory perspective. So almost 6-7 years back, the Air Navigation Commission of ICAO requested the aerodrome panel to perform a gap analysis on what is existing in ICAO material and in the industry, which is fairly mature, to see about what are the work that ICAO needs to do, what are the provisions that needs to be done on ground handling. There were some elementary provisions or mention about ground handling in say Annex 6, Annex 14. So the idea is to do a bit of gap analysis, and there are extensive material in the industry, say for example, the IATA material, ACI material. So in order to do that, a ground handling task force was set up. I'm not going to get into the details of this because Andrew Badham, the rapporteur of this particular task force, is going to talk about it in the next section. So a gap analysis was conducted and a work program was finalized for ICAO to work on this particular topic of ground handling. The first deliverable of this was a comprehensive manual on ground handling. So this presentation is more going to be on what this ground handling manual is all about. So this manual was published way back in 2019, which we call it as Doc 10121. It's a comprehensive document. We are getting very good feedback on this particular document. It's pretty comprehensive. It covers all the topics. It's at the same time to the point and easy to use. Extensive work and research has been done on this document. The main idea, as we all know, the domain of ground handling is more of a tripartite one, which involves the aerodrome operator, the air operator, and the ground handling service provider. So this particular manual tries to address the issues of this particular three agencies and see how we can work together in order to ensure a safe and efficient operations. As it was already mentioned, this manual was prepared in collaboration with states and the industry. We need to thank quite a lot of extensive references have been made on the industry material as well, thanks to IATA, ACI, IBAC, and ASA for their support. So this is one of the best documents of this aerodrome section. So getting on to this particular document, on the contents of this document, the first chapter sets the scene. It provides an introduction of what is there in this particular manual. As we saw, ground handling is a bit of a complex thing which involves multiple stakeholders. So this manual provides guidance for each of these stakeholders. Say, for example, it says about how safety is important for ground handling. It talks about the introduction to the first chapter, talks about the challenges for ground handling service providers, say, for example, staffing, the balance between safety and efficiency in terms of the human factors, in terms of workplace conditions, in terms of the ground support equipment maintenance, so on and so forth. So, and explains how safety principles and SMS helps in addressing these challenges. The next chapter, that is chapter 2, is specifically for the states in terms of how they can define their state safety programs to assess the impact of ground handling in their aviation safety, how to address these impacts through their local regulations, and to have safety promotions to address those things, to take it forward so that they can have in their state safety program the database on the ground handling incidents, accidents, and to see about how they can support this industry in ensuring safety. So chapter 2 elaborately talks about the state safety program. Chapter 3 is a guidance on air operators or the aircraft operators. Chapter 3 is more on the guidance on air operators or aircraft operators. It talks about the interface because they are the major customers for the ground handling service providers. So it talks about the interface between the aircraft operator and the ground handling service provider in terms of what kind of contract they need to have between them for the safety and efficiency. It also refers to the industry guidance material, which is available, which is the IATA, IHM, which is already a well-established one. And it also provides guidance on the interface required between the ground handling service provider and the general aviation or the business aviation. So it is quite an extensive chapter on the guidance to air operators. The fourth chapter is the main bulk of this particular manual. It's on the guidance to the ground handling service provider. It provides guidance on the need for implementing safety principles by the ground handling service providers. It talks predominantly about SMS and how safety culture can help in ensuring an efficient way of ground handling operations at an aerodrome. So it also says that it's not just ground handling, because there may be some ground handlers who operate only one aircraft in an aerodrome. So it talks about scalability as well. Based on the size and complexity of their operations, they can have their SMS. So this chapter is predominantly on how ground handling service providers can use safety management systems to address their management issues as well. And in addition, it also talks about the interface required between the ground handling service providers on things like airport collaborative decision-making. It talks about human factors, the dirty dozen. It talks about the ground service equipments, and also it touches upon the occupational health and safety aspects related to the ground handling service provider, which is another important topic. The fifth chapter is more to do with the agency or the owners of the land, the aerodrome operators. It talks about the local regulations issued, the local safety regulations issued by the aerodrome operator, because it has got the driving discipline in the common area, the personal safety, so on and so forth, and how that needs to be interfaced. It also talks about the emergency response planning, which is also responsive to the aerodrome operator, and how it needs to be interfaced with the ground handling service provider. It also talks about the apron design which the aerodrome operator needs to take into consideration in order to ensure safe and efficient ground handling operations at their premises. So it's quite comprehensive. It gives specific guidance to each one of these stakeholders. The last chapter, chapter 6, is sort of talks about the operating procedures. It says about the general operating procedures, general safety procedures. What is the role of each one of these agencies, the air operator, the GHSP, and the aerodrome operator? So say, for example, if you look at the passenger boarding bridge, which is something at times owned by the aerodrome operator, what is the role of the aerodrome operator in having that passenger boarding bridge? What is the role of the air operator or the aircraft operator at which their aircraft is being used, the passenger boarding bridge is being used for their aircraft? And also, what is the ground handling service provider, the training and competency required? So it provides extensive details on each one of these topics, the general safety regulations, as well as the turnaround process. So this particular manual provides a comprehensive thing on what each agency should do on this particular complex topic of ground handling. There are around 8 appendices to this particular manual, providing rich examples on how to do risk assessment, some examples on safety oversight being conducted by some states, some examples of safety performance indicators for the ground handling service providers, so on and so forth. So overall, it's an extensive manual, even though it's just got 112 pages. It's written in a simple and lucid manner so that it's easy for us to understand and implement. So to have an idea on what are the topics covered in this manual, this particular matrix gives you an example of the extent of topics covered. If you look at column 2, it's predominantly about the guidance for states, the state safety program. But I would rather like to draw your attention to the orange box, highlight that particular thing. It clearly indicates that we can no longer work in silos. If you look at it, it talks about the interface required between the 3 agencies, the tripartite, which I had already mentioned, between the air operator, the ground handling service provider, and the aerodrome, be it the management principles, the organization setup, the SMS, the interface required between their SMS, and the link which is required between their SOPs. So this is a very important principle which has been brought out in this particular manual, which very clearly shows that we need to work together in order to ensure safety and efficiency. So this brings us to another question on what are the key principles. I would like to draw your attention to have a closer look at this particular matrix. It's quite clear that SMS and the way we organize ourselves as various domain experts is critical. So which takes us to the next slide. It's quite clear that the ICAO safety management system, and we are quite clear that SMS is good for business. And the state safety program as an oversight should include ground handling as one of its components. We already talked about scalability based on the size and complexity of the service provider. And the other thing is about standardization. We do understand the challenges in global standardization. However, the endeavor is to have some kind of a harmonization or standardization within a particular ecosystem, be it within an airport or a group of airports within the state. That's what we are striving for. And of course, we have talked elaborately about coordination and collaboration, without which the system cannot function. And last but not the least is on the use of best practices by industry. This manual supports use of best practices from industry, which is fairly mature, be it IATA, ACI, or IBAC. So overall, this gives a clear idea, a good guidance on what we need to do when it comes to ground handling, be it from a regulatory perspective or from an industry perspective, for us to ensure ground handling safety. So this, in a sense, concludes my presentation. However, I've just got one more slide to show about the importance given by ICAO on ground handling. There was supposed to be a high-level safety conference this year, but now it's been converted into a high-level conference on COVID-19. Which is likely there's going to be a stated ratio shortly on the dates and how it's going to be conducted. Maybe because of COVID, this may be conducted as a virtual meeting. The good thing is that ground handling is going to be a part of this agenda in spite of this being a COVID conference. It's a part of the agenda, and the objective is quite clear here, because ground handling is of increasing importance to safety, regularity, efficiency, and performance of airport operation. And we are looking for standardizing the oversight approach for ground handling activities. So since in this meeting, we have experts from states and the industry organizations on ground handling, we request to, if you're invited for this particular conference, to submit papers and take part in the discussions so that it will help ICAO in continuing the work on ground handling and take it forward in the next triennium. That's all from me. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, RC, por tu presentación y muchas gracias por la invitación a todos los estados a contribuir con notas de estudio para esta interesante reunión que vamos a tener en el mes de octubre. Qué bueno que se haya podido incluir el ground handling o los servicios de escala en la agenda. A continuación, quisiera pedirle a nuestro colega Andrew Badham de la Autoridad de Aviación Civil del Reino Unido para que nos haga la siguiente presentación sobre el trabajo actual y futuro del grupo de tarea de ground handling. Andrew.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me and see my screen before I start?
Todo muy bien, Andrew. Te escuchamos y se ve la pantalla. Adelante.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you, first of all, to the ICAO South American Regional Office for this opportunity to discuss the work of the Ground Handling Task Force of the Aerodrome Design and Operations Panel. My name is Andrew Badham. I'm the Policy Principal for Aerodromes, Meteorology and Aeronautical Information at the United Kingdom Civil Aviation Authority. I've been in aviation now for nearly 40 years. I've been with the CAA for 12 years, responsible for aerodrome regulation. Prior to that, I had 20 years in industry in aerodrome operations and safety, and I was 6 years as an air traffic controller prior to that. I'm the current rapporteur or leader of the Ground Handling Task Force of ICAO, and I also chair the ICAO Aerodrome Design and Operations panel. So this presentation now follows on from what we saw with RC, and I'd like to give you some of what we are currently working on and where we hope to be in a couple of years' time. Just a quick reminder, nothing happens in ICAO without a job card. This is a copy of the original job card we had. The request for the work came from the Air Navigation Commission and a number of states to look at the ground handling issue, as there were a lot of concerns regarding the number of ground handling accidents and incidents. Over the years, I've attended a number of ground handling conferences, and over the past few years, there's been a growing concern about the number of accidents and incidents, and an interesting statistic has cropped up several times. Now, I'm sure some people will tell me if this is right or wrong, but it's currently estimated that over 75% of the global ground handling is now carried out by third parties, not by airlines. And as a result, these are largely unregulated by states, apart from through the airlines themselves. It is a huge segment of the aviation system, employing many hundreds of thousands of people involved in the turnaround of again, hundreds of thousands of aircraft. A significant section, but not really regulated. Having spoken to many people over the years in the industry and having worked in it myself, I show here some global generalities, and I'm sure some of this will cause some questions later on. I'm sure it doesn't reflect every state, nor every ground handler. The ground handling environment we see has a very wide range of capability and a very large range and size of operations at each of the airports. Particular trends noted, and these are still current, I think, despite the pandemic. There are continued pressures from airlines to reduce costs all the time. And many people are now asking the question, how low can you go? And is there a point where safety standards become affected? So is the cheapest tender necessarily the best? The recovery phase post-COVID, I think, will only make matters more difficult, as many of the airlines, the ground handlers, and the airports will be struggling economically and looking to reduce costs. We'll hear later a bit more from IATA about damage, but there does seem to be an unrelenting trend of damage and injury, and the current estimate, which I've heard a number of times, is somewhere in the region of $4 billion US annually in direct costs to airlines, and that's just direct costs. So the operating models at the aerodromes do vary, and ground handling can be carried out by an airline, an aerodrome, a third-party provider, or a state. We heard from RC about the ground handling manual. This was the first deliverable by the ground handling task force from the job card that we saw earlier, published in late 2019. It took several years to develop and publish, but has been welcomed generally, and I think is a very useful and practical document. It's interesting to note as well that in Europe, EASA is taking this as one of its prime influences in its development of ground handling regulation for its 26 states. The ground handling task force itself, I've been privileged to work with a lot of experts and a lot of very knowledgeable people over the last few years. We've had a lot of input from IATA, ACI, IBAC, and ASA, all of whom we'll hear from today. Also a number of states and the ICC AIA, who represent the aircraft manufacturers. They've all helped develop the chapters that you saw earlier. So the task force includes experts that currently either directly regulate ground handlers, they operate airports, airlines, and ground handling service providers themselves. So it's a very, very good mix of expertise. We saw from RC's presentation earlier about those main themes. I won't go through them in detail again, but they are very strong themes, and these are the themes we are now taking forward into the next phase of the work, which is developing a package of standards and recommended practices for a number of annexes and a new chapter for the PANS aerodrome document. So there's the resume of the phase 2. We have been working on this since the manual was produced. So we've had 2 years working on this already. The annexes are affected where we want some change made. As you can see, there are 6, 8, 9, 14, and 19, together with a new chapter for PANS aerodrome. And the aim ultimately is to comprehensively embed safety management systems into ground handling. So those are the key annexes. And again, what we'll have hopefully in several years' time, because this is the procedure that ICAO will work from. We already have the manual. We'll have a brand new chapter for the PANS aerodrome, which sits above the manual. And then we'll have a suite of standards and recommended practices in a number of annexes, so we get the complete package. So that's what we're working on. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. Here we see the current draft recommended practices for the 3 parts of Annex 6. These are just examples and are still work in progress, so please don't take these as finished at the moment, but they are quite mature. So again, we are looking at proposing harmonized sets of ground handling procedures, more responsibilities for the pilot in command, particularly aimed at business aviation and general aviation, and also the development of policies for third-party handling. So we're covering all 3 parts of Annex 6. Annex 8, airworthiness. This proposed recommendation is aimed at improving the availability of aircraft dimensions and servicing characteristics for ground handlers. The major manufacturers such as Boeing and Airbus are good at this, but some of the smaller manufacturers do need improvement. And there have been a number of issues where ground handlers need more information about how to turn aircraft around. Annex 9, facilitation. We've proposed a critical new recommendation here dealing with how ground handling service providers are selected during the tendering process by taking into account the safety record of the ground handler and not just the price. We're also taking the opportunity to have a bit of consistency with the use of the term GHSP. Annex 14, this is the one that the ADOP owns and looks after. So again, I've given some examples of proposed provisions. Again, at the heart of our work is the aim to get safety management system as a requirement for ground handling service providers. It isn't at the moment. We've had a lot of detailed discussions with the safety management panel, who are the owners of Annex 19. These discussions are still ongoing, and we will be working closely with the safety management panel this year to finalize our package of proposals. One way which has been suggested to get SMS into ground handlers is to encourage states to use what's called discretionary SMS, and thus extend the requirement for safety management systems to ground handlers as part of the state safety plan. You can see from some of the items there, we're also proposing additional recommendations for apron design and operation, and additional provisions for training and vehicle operations and maintenance. We're also aware, and RC did mention this, that there needs to be more perhaps a harmony between state occupational health and safety and aviation safety regulations so that they work together. And finally, Annex 19, safety management. It's always been our aim as a task force right from the beginning to get SMS extended to ground handlers within Annex 19. This has proved difficult. We've had very long and difficult discussions with the safety management panel and are still working closely with them to get to this position. But we may have to use the discretionary SMS route as a first step. The current most effective way, as was previously mentioned, was to get it into the state safety plan, because I don't believe there will be many states that could honestly say that ground handling is not an issue to them. We just want now to elevate it and get states to say, right, use safety management principles and take the information that you find in the safety management manual, Annex 19, and our own ground handling manual. So progress, we've met consistently since 2015. We've reported a number of times to the ADOP, who give their continued support for the work. We're currently developing a package of proposed SARP amendments, and there have been positive coordination between the ADOP Secretariat and the other affected Annex Secretariats. The plan at the moment is to present this full mature package to the ADOP in November of this year, following a number of formal presentations at other affected panels and speaking with the panel members during the middle part of this year. So that's my final slide. I've tried to explain the current plan and work of the Ground Handling Task Force of ADOP. The justification for the extension of SMS into ground handling through the various annexes, I think, is sound, and as we'll hear later, is based on good accident data and supported by significant sections of industry. Many ground handlers, as we know, already use the ICAO SMS framework, and I believe we would be pushing on an open door with many states and industry with this development. So thank you for your attention, and I hope this has given you a good appreciation of what we are currently doing and why we continue to work collaboratively in this important area of aviation safety. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Andrew, por tu presentación y por ese mensaje de trabajo colaborativo que es importante en esta área que quizás no está siendo vista por muchos de nuestros estados de una manera integral. Muchas gracias, Andrew, por tu presentación. Damos paso ahora a dos estados invitados para que nos brinden su perspectiva con respecto a ground handling o a los servicios a escala. Primero tenemos a Brasil, Leonardo Esteves de la ANAC Brasil. Por favor, Leonardo. Mientras Leonardo prepara su presentación, los exhorto a que si tienen preguntas utilicen el botón de Q&A de preguntas y respuestas. Nosotros al final de la sesión, como indicamos, si alcanza el tiempo, podemos responder algunas. Adelante, Leonardo, gracias.
Okay, thank you, Fabio. Can you see my presentation and hear me well?
Se escucha bien y se ve tu presentación, Leonardo. Adelante, gracias.
Okay, so as requested, the idea here is to present a little bit of the state perspective on this subject. My name is Leonardo Esteves, and I work at the Brazilian Civil Aviation Agency in the Aerodrome Infrastructure Department. And in this presentation, I will try to show a little bit of how Brazil regulates ground handling services, and also to show some examples of safety promotion actions and other actions that we have been developing in the past years to monitor safety on ground handling safety on ground handling services. So do you see the next slide?
No se ve, not yet. Oh, there you go. Now we see it.
So initially, I would like to present a little bit of some figures about the ground handling market in Brazil. So this information is from 2016, and at the time we had 211 independent ground handling service providers with more than 30,000 employees. The number of airports assisted was 140, and if we exclude fueling services, this number was 104. In the same year, we had 127 airports operating commercial aviation. So it shows that in some airports, the self-handling was basically the only option for airlines. And it was estimated that 70% of the ground handling services was outsourced in the commercial aviation. But I believe this number today is even greater than that, because in 2018 we had some changes in specific airline. So we can see the challenge here is that we have a large number of companies. Some of them are small businesses. Of course, we also have big multinationals operating in Brazil. And also, these numbers here refer to the number of companies, but they often operate in more than one airport. So the number of operational bases would be much more significant. So, and how do we regulate these services in Brazil? Basically, we do not have direct regulation for the ground handling service providers, but we do have regulation for the ground handling services in general. We internalize the existing standards and recommended practices and processes in the regulations that are applicable to air operators and to airports. So we understand that in this model that we adopt, each of these three stakeholders has main roles. So the air operator will, as contractor of the services, they will have to agree the process and procedures with the GHSP. And also they have a responsibility to measure safety performance to ensure that the service provided that is being provided on its behalf, it's according to existing regulation and the safety performance that has been agreed. And the airport also has a responsibility to establish some specific safety standards, local safety rules, mainly related to the movement of vehicles in the apron and things like this. Of course, they also have to audit and inspect the GHSPs to ensure that these local safety rules are being followed. And finally, it plays an important role as the coordinator of these three stakeholders at the local level. So it is mainly the airport role to promote this coordination. And of course, the GHSP will provide the services according to these rules and regulations.
Leonardo,
yes.
sorry to interrupt you. Can you move closer to the microphone? The translator said that they have trouble, a little bit of echo. Thank you, Leonardo. Sorry about that.
Okay, so do you hear me well now?
I think it's better. Thank you, Leonardo.
Okay. So, and I was going to talk about the role of regulator. So according to the manual on ground handling, the states should, as part of their state safety program, to assess the impact of ground handling operations on aviation safety. And the result of these this impact assessment, as a result of they should manage this impact using the tools that are available for states, and also to decide what kind of safety promotion actions would be necessary to deal with the issues that have been identified. So in Brazil, we have been trying to do that in a certain way. We do not have a formal process in the SSP to assess the impact of ground handling, but in a way, that's what we have been doing through safety data collection and analysis. And we also have been developing some safety promotion actions. And in the next slides, I will basically show you some examples of these kind of actions that we have been doing, mainly in the aerodrome area. So in this first table, we see some safety performance indicators that we have been collecting for a few years. These are number of events per 10,000 departures, so we can compare between the different airports. We have here data from 12 airports for 2 different years. And the safety performance indicators here are the collision involving one aircraft. Basically, this is most of the cases collision between the ground support equipment with an aircraft. Then we have a specific indicator related to collision between 2 aircrafts. Then the next one is collision between vehicles equipment, could be between 2 ground support equipment or between ground support equipment and infrastructure. And finally, the presence of FOD in the movement areas. We are aware that these numbers, these occurrences here may not reflect the extent of these occurrences. There are some statistics from IATA, for example, that shows that almost 2/3 of the ground damage is not reported. They are simply found, the aircraft damage. So, but it's still a valuable information. We try to review and the trends of these numbers, and it allows us to act when necessary. Here in this slide, I show some slightly more recent data. This is from the last 12 months, and it's also events reported by aerodrome operators. And in this period, we had 482 occurrences reported, but 49 involved ground handling, almost a little bit more than 10%. And when we analyze the type of events that we usually have, the most frequent ones, we have the most common one is collision not involving aircraft. So it's the ones that I've shown here before. Collisions between GSC and infrastructure is with 12 occurrences. Between 2 GSCs, 9 occurrences. Then we have damage to aircraft. We have 10 occurrences related to damage to aircraft. And we have divided here in two different levels of severity. The ones resulting in delay, considered to be of major severity, we had 6. And they are mostly, most of the time, related to also to collision between a GSC and the aircraft, and sometimes damage during pushback and towing processes. These are basically causes of this damage. And the minor damage here are usually damage to an aircraft where there is no delay because there's no necessary of an immediate maintenance. And other frequent events that we see is hydraulic fluid spillage, basically from GSE, all the cases here. Fuel spillage also. In most of the cases during refueling of aircraft, but one of the cases was related to GSE. And finally, other events that were considered to be of less, of lower severity. This basically involves some luggage or pieces of cargo that falls during the transportation, surface transportation, the apron, or failure to follow procedures, such as the presence of a GSE inside the stand safety line. We have tried to classify these events in terms of severity, as you can see here, and we have used as reference the information from the manual on ground handling in the Appendix C. We have a list of events and its severities. And in this specific last 12 months, none of these events involved injury to people. And finally, I would like to show an example of a safety promotion action. This is also related to aerodrome operations. It's a guidance material for airports, and basically it brings information on how the airport could promote some actions to improve communication, coordination, and cooperation with the ground handling service providers, such as the creation of apron safety committees and the establishment of some local safety rules in the agreement with the GHSPs. Also, the material includes general safety standards that could be used as reference for the establishment of the local safety rules. And also guidance on how airport operators could monitor ground handling services through safety audits and safety turnaround inspections, including checklists. So basically, this is what I had to show in the time available. I am open to questions at the end of the session. So thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Leonardo, por tu presentación. Pudimos observar una de las perspectivas, de un estado de cómo atiende el tema de ground handling. Así que te agradecemos mucho por compartir esa experiencia. Ahora le voy a pedir a mi colega Adolfo Medina de la DGAC de Perú para que nos brinde la perspectiva desde el punto de vista de la DGAC peruana. Adolfo.
¿Qué tal? Buenos días con todos. Buenos días, Fabio.
Asegúrate de tomar el botón de interpretación, colocar español. Gracias.
Ya. Ok, ¿ven mi presentación y me escuchan?
Sí te escucho, pero no veo la presentación aún.
Bueno, lo he... A ver.
Inténtalo a ver, si no yo la puedo presentar por ti también. Ay, ya se está mostrando.
Ya, listo. ¿Está?
Sí, ya se ve, gracias.
Ya, ok. Buenos días con todos. Bueno, en este caso la presentación que vamos a llevar es cómo lo vemos desde el punto de vista de Perú, cómo hemos incorporado la regulación, ¿no? Y cómo gestionamos la provisión de estos servicios en los aeropuertos. Bueno, vamos a tener primero concepto, el marco legal, requisitos de los operadores, ¿no? Condiciones y los retos que se nos vienen ahora como autoridad, ¿no? En Perú, los servicios de escala, ¿no? Son conocidos como servicios especializados aeroportuarios, ¿no? Estos están definidos como servicios que se prestan dentro y fuera de la plataforma, ¿no? Vinculados a servicios prestados directamente a las aeronaves con ocasión de transporte aéreo, ¿no? O cuando para su ejecución se ejecutan o se utilizan equipos, infraestructura especializada, ¿no? Nosotros tenemos varias habilitaciones entre otros servicios de escala, así le llamamos nosotros, ¿no? Terminal de carga es una de ellas, que no está, hay almacenes dentro del aeropuerto como almacenes fuera del aeropuerto. Están los equipos de ground handling, ¿no? El suministro de combustible, el catering, ¿no? Que es el suministro de agua, bebidas y alimentos, ¿no? Las empresas que brindan servicio a la aviación general, ¿no? Que son los operadores de base fija, y el servicio de seguridad, ¿no? Ahí podemos ver ahí una ilustración, ¿no? El servicio de seguridad, de cierta forma, no es el tema de security, ¿no? Sino que hay empresas de seguridad que dan servicios en la plataforma, ¿no? Y estas personas salen de la infraestructura aeroportuaria, del terminal, ¿no? Y entran a la plataforma, ¿no? Y dan servicios de guardianía a las aeronaves, ¿no? Y en algunos casos a los pasajeros o a la carga cuando es estibada o es llevada del almacén a la aeronave, ¿no? Entonces estas empresas deben de cumplir con requisitos de seguridad operacional para el desplazamiento de su personal y sus vehículos dentro de la plataforma de los aeropuertos, ¿no? Con respecto al marco legal, ¿no? Estos servicios están reglamentados en nuestra ley, ¿no? La ley 28404, que es la denominada Ley de Seguridad de la Aviación Civil, ¿no? Está incorporado en esta ley, quizás por no incluirla en la Ley de la Aviación Civil, que ya había sido promulgada, ¿no? Esta ley fue promulgada en noviembre del 2004, ¿no? Y en la ley establece las definiciones y los alcances de estos servicios, ¿no? Y el reglamento y las RAP establecen los procedimientos bajo los cuales estos van a operar en los aeropuertos, ¿no? La regulación aeronáutica, en este caso la RAP 111, titulada Permiso de Operación, Certificación de Operador y Regulaciones de los Servicios Especiales Aeroportuarios, ¿no? En esta regulación se establece que las empresas para operar deben de contar con un certificado y un permiso, ¿no? Razón por la cual tienen que obtener a través de un proceso dichos documentos, ¿no? Y también la RAP determina las razones por las cuales pueden ser suspendidos o cancelados estos permisos, ¿no? Ahí en la presentación está el link desde el cual pueden descargar la regulación, ¿no? Los requisitos esenciales, ¿no? Esenciales para obtener el certificado es, uno, que la empresa demuestre contar con capacidad económica financiera, ¿no? Sea una empresa nueva o una empresa que ya esté operando, ¿no? De la misma forma, la capacidad legal. La capacidad legal se basa en el cumplimiento de requisitos normativos de otras dependencias, ¿no? En este caso, si es alimentos, podría ser el Ministerio de Salud, ¿no? En el caso de combustible es energía y minas, ¿no? Y así sucesivamente, dependiendo del servicio que se brinden, deberían de cumplir con otras normas legales que determinen otras dependencias del Estado para la misma operación, ¿no? Y por último, la capacidad técnica, ¿no? La capacidad técnica está sustentada, uno, en el equipamiento, ¿no? El equipamiento que se va a utilizar, el personal, ¿no? El personal que se va a emplear, así como su capacitación. La capacitación y el equipamiento de protección personal que debe utilizar este personal, ¿no? La pérdida de una de estas capacidades es causal para anular, suspender o cancelar los permisos otorgados a la citada empresa, ¿no? Dentro de las condiciones y reglas generales que se han determinado en la norma, ¿no? O en la regulación, está uno, la información, ¿no? Que debe llegar al personal, ¿no? En este caso son procedimientos, ¿no? La capacitación, ¿no? La capacitación en cuanto al equipamiento, y cuando esta capacitación incluye, o el procedimiento incluye tocar, manipular, ¿no? O en este caso hacer la estiva y desestiva de carga de la aeronave, se debe de contar con capacitación del operador aéreo, ¿no? Y para ello también debe haber un procedimiento que debe estar incluido en un manual que nos van a presentar a nosotros como autoridad, ¿no? También está el contar con un programa de prevención de consumo de alcohol y drogas, ¿no? Los manuales deben ser actualizados y aprobados por la DGAC, ¿no? Y operar de acuerdo a las especificaciones, ¿no? O sea, la DGAC da autorizaciones indistintamente por cada operador, dependiendo de la actividad que va a desarrollar, ¿no? Se le otorgan ciertas atribuciones en estas especificaciones, ¿no? Otro tema importante también son los acuerdos firmados con los operadores aéreos. ¿Ya? Es necesario de que los operadores aéreos suscriban un acuerdo, ¿no? Un acuerdo con los servicios especializados con respecto a los servicios que se van a brindar, ¿no? Ya que estas empresas dan servicios tanto a operadores aéreos nacionales como internacionales, ¿no? En el caso de tener equipos que requieren de calibración, estos deben ser calibrados también, ¿no? Y estas calibraciones deben estar presentadas a la DGAC cuando se lo solicite, ¿no? También es muy importante el tema del foto, ¿no? Eso también se exige en la norma y tiene que estar documentado el tema de la gestión y la capacitación relacionada con el foto, ¿no? Y igual, las medidas para proporcionar la seguridad de las personas, equipaje, carga y correo, ¿no? Al explotar aéreo también se le dan responsabilidades en la regulación, ¿no? Entonces, el explotar de aeródromo es responsable de velar, ¿no? Y de hacer cumplir la RAP 111, ¿no? Y remitir a la DGAC el reporte mensual de faltas cometidas, ¿no? Mensualmente los operadores de aeródromo nos hacen la remisión de estas faltas, ¿no? También los servicios especializados, en este caso, también nos remiten a nosotros, en este caso, los accidentes o incidentes en el uso de sus funciones, ¿no? El explorador de aeródromo también debe de contar con un manual de plataforma, ¿no? Se agregó este requisito en la RAP 111, dado que el anexo 14 no establecía el tema de la plataforma como área geométrica, y también algunos requisitos que están en el capítulo 9, ¿no? Pero no exigía en particular el contar con un manual de plataforma. Entonces nosotros en la RAP 111 ya venimos exigiendo a los explotadores aéreos, a los de aeródromo, contar con dicho manual, ¿no? Este manual debe establecer procedimientos para el equipamiento, traslado de personal y vehículos en la plataforma, ¿no? También esto precisa las identificaciones y marcas que deben llevar todo vehículo que esté autorizado a transitar por la plataforma, ¿no? También se debe establecer un procedimiento para otorgar el acceso a la plataforma. ¿Ya? Este procedimiento no es un procedimiento de security, ¿no? Es un procedimiento de safety, de seguridad operacional, ¿no? Este procedimiento tiene que involucrar, uno, el equipo de protección personal, ¿no? Si la persona que va a ingresar está capacitada o no para estar dentro de la plataforma, ¿no? Y quién es el responsable, sobre todo, de solicitar estos accesos, ¿no? También esto debe de señalar en el manual de plataforma los requisitos de entrenamiento para el manejo de vehículos dentro del aeropuerto, ¿no? Y asimismo precisa que no está autorizado el uso de la plataforma para el depósito de bienes de condición de almacenamiento y su manipulación, ¿no? Esto es porque en algunos aeropuertos se dejaba la carga en la plataforma, ¿no? Se dejaba la carga incluso horas antes de que la aeronave llegara o se estacionara, ¿no? Con la finalidad de abreviar este procedimiento, ¿no? Este proceso de estiva y de desestiva, ¿no? Lo cual ya está controlado aquí, ¿no? Bueno, con respecto a los retos, ¿no? Los retos es el de actualizar nuestra regulación, conforme a las recomendaciones del documento 10.121 de OASI, ¿no? Puesto que nuestra norma es muy antigua, ¿no? Fue elaborada en el 2004, ¿no? Y fue elaborada con la finalidad de reglamentar de alguna manera la operación de estos servicios, ¿no? Este documento nos va a permitir a nosotros interactuar y asimismo garantizar las interfaces en el SMS de los explotadores de aeródromo, ¿no? Los explotadores aéreos y estas empresas de los servicios los de escala, ¿no? A fines de garantizar la seguridad operacional, ¿no? Y poder tener un control sobre estas actividades, ¿no? Bueno, es la presentación con respecto a cómo regulamos en Perú estos servicios, ¿no? Bueno, con esto finalizo la presentación y quedo atento a cualquier consulta para más adelante.
Adolfo, muchísimas gracias por compartirnos la perspectiva peruana y qué buena noticia saber que están trabajando en actualizar su regulación nacional en base al documento trabajado por el Ground Handling Task Force. Muchas gracias nuevamente, Adolfo. A continuación voy a pedirle a mi colega Fabio Gamba del ASA si puede brindar su presentación en la perspectiva de ASA,
Yes.
la perspectiva de los ground
Good
handlers.
morning. I will try.
Adelante, Fabio, disculpe.
Yes, indeed. Here we go. Can you see the slide?
Sí se ve, Fabio, gracias.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Fabio Gamba. I'm the ASA Director General. I'm one of the Fabios of this webinar. And it is my pleasure to be here with you this morning. I will try and shed some light on the beautiful sector or industry of ground handling service provision, and try and see and how we can, together with what ICAO has been doing, how we can together work in hands. Let me see if I can move the slides. I think it's like this. Yeah. To start with, perhaps, Fabio, just an explanation on Airport Services Association, ASA. It was established quite recently in 2011, even though actually it is succeeding very much an older association called IAHA that was created back in the 1970s with pretty much the same objectives, which are, or purposes, which are to represent the independent ground handling service providers worldwide. And I underline independence. I'll come back in a few seconds on what it means or what we mean by that. You have a view of the membership of the ASA as of today. We are basically open to all ground handling service providers as full members, and also to other providers, to GHSPs, mostly GSC providers, as associate members. Very basic question, sorry if I'm asking it, but I think it's always good to make sure that we all talk about the same thing. We've heard a number of definitions from the previous panelists. Obviously, it's quite difficult to include ground handling into a common definition because it involves so many aspects. But generally, I think it's fair to say that there are mostly two areas that can define or that are the pillars, if you will, of ground handling. These are passenger services, under which you can find all things like check-in, passenger with reduced mobility, lounges, lost and found, etc. And then the other aspect, which is what I guess we will be mostly talking this morning about, which is ramp services, where you have everything related to luggages, to de-icing, to fueling, towing of aircraft, of course, and moving, ground power units, cleaning, etc. And then there is also a third aspect, which is not always talked about, which is everything related to cargo and their warehouses. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list, and this is not intended to, and obviously as well, depending on the type of contract, depending on the type of licenses, and depending on the type of airports served, one GHSP might do a number of these services, or sometimes even all of them. Now, quickly, ground handling around the world. It's extremely difficult to gather an exact number of both ground handling service providers and employees, but it is generally estimated, at least we do estimate, that GHSPs employ around between 600 and 700,000 employees. That is, of course, before 2019, before the pandemic, until 2019, before the pandemic. Back then, the whole ground handling business was estimated to be worth around $120 billion annually, representing typically between 7 and 9% of airlines' operating costs. I mentioned independence. I think it's fair to say that there are three, a bit more, but let's say to make it simple, there are three types of ground handling: the independent ground handlers, the self-handlers done by airlines, and then airport subsidiaries. ASA mostly, I should not say only, but mostly represents the first type, the independent type. And as we've heard from previous panelists, it's estimated today that between 60 and 65, I even heard 70 up to 75%, at least growing, of the total ground handling operations worldwide are being done by what I call the independent ground handling service providers. Right, state of the industry would be difficult to do with that, especially in these days. Up to 55% of the total employees today worldwide have been or are in a certain way either furloughed or outright laid off. Around $200 billion have been guaranteed through grants and loans by a number of states to their ailing airlines during the pandemic, which is good, and we applauded that. Unfortunately, only less than 2%, and that's again an estimate, was made available to airline contractors, and in particular to us ground handlers. Of these measures, job retention schemes have been by far the most used, if not the only measures that we have been able to count on. Unfortunately, these schemes have come to an end, at least a lot of them have come to an end by the end of 2020, which, as you may imagine, given the situation, is extremely bad news for a lot of ground handlers. And if they have not been put, or terminated by the end of 2020, at best, they have been terminated by the first quarter of 2021. So that's really something that I wanted to drag your attention on. Bankruptcies haven't been on the front page yet, but I need to say that I'm also certain that 2021 to 2022 will be, I think, by far the most challenging period for ground handling, even though we can already see some light at the end of the tunnel. These things always take some time, and we will see the knock-on effects, I'm afraid, in the second part of 21 and throughout 2022. I'm saying here that there are adverse effects on safety that can be expected or feared. I'll come back on that, but obviously when you are confronted with a distressed situation in a distressed industry, then you tend to have some companies who are incentivized, let's put it that way, to cut corners. The major pain points of the sector are basically two, I would say. First of all, the lack of common legislation. And it's interesting to see that despite the fact everyone would agree, as been said before, that this is a key aspect of the safety of air transport, there is no specifically dedicated annexes in the ICAO dedicated to ground handling. There are many annexes, as we've seen before, that do have chapters or do have ground handling as as a topic, but it's rather as a consequence than the cause, right? And it's interesting to note as well that competition and perhaps more than safety constitutes aspects that states have agreed to legislate on. I'm taking the example here of the market access directive in the European Commission. Of course, there are a number of exceptions, and I wanted to congratulate the examples of Peru and Brazil. There are a few others, of course, but these remain, unfortunately, today exceptions. There are obviously industry standards that exist, and I must say that some of them are absolutely top-notch, and I think that we'll hear from them in a little while. But it's always a little bit the same problem. In the absence of a general legal framework or state regulation, their application is difficult and it generates pushback sometimes, if not even deviances, which actually weakens the whole value of the standard itself and to a certain extent defeats its own purpose. And again, I think we need to remember that in extreme times or in pandemics, such as the one that we're going through, this absence or this vacuum of binding norms may lead to, again, to dangerous cross-cuttings. So ground handling is a very labor-intensive industry sector, as we have seen. It offers career opportunities for all levels, for a lot of people, at least until COVID, and gives a job to hundreds of thousands of people worldwide. And there are only very, very few barriers to getting a job in ground handling. And yet, despite all that, it is generally not considered as providing a valid professional career. The question is why? And the answer is pretty straightforward, because people qualifications are not recognized. And it is difficult for them to be recognized in the absence of an ad hoc legislation. As a consequence of their qualifications not being recognized, there is a very high turnover within the sector, which in turn leads to very high costs of training. So training people for procedures that differ depending either on the country, on the station, or even on the airline is already hard, but it becomes even harder in case of high turnover, as we're faced it. I mean, you have to realize that obviously for a lot of ground handlers themselves, the motivation of knowing that you have to train hard in order to be able to work, if this is not recognized, is then getting pretty low. And people, as soon as they can, will probably leave this sector. So you have to train new ones, newcomers, and so on and so forth. And it is an endless, bottomless pit. That's why I also conclude this slide by saying that, again, safety concerns may surface here. Ground handling is also a lot about procedures. Now, we've heard that outsourcing ground handling helps keeping airlines and airports as well financially viable. I think it's fair to say that the system so far has worked and coped, partly thanks or because of the service level agreements and the airport licenses. And it has done so at least until the pandemic. It has certainly shown resistance and has adapted to the growing pressures of airlines, the airports, and the passengers. And God knows that these, let's say, growing pressures are now extreme, and you see more and more, or less and less time, actually, between turnarounds, and you have to adapt to the business with, the same level of safety at a lower cost. In order to be able to do that, many ground handling service providers have developed quite sophisticated processes with respect to quality controls internally, obviously. But, and that's a major but, in the absence of binding checks and balances, it's clear that there is a gray zone that has managed to thrive. And this gray zone is leading to, let's say, not rewarding those adopting these control measures, always. So the feeling is that the more you're adapting yourself to the situation, the more you're controlling your quality, the safety, and the more you are being, outrun by smaller entities, which are perhaps sometimes cutting corners. And that is obviously the case even more so during extreme times, such as today, thus questioning the whole sustainability of the sector. As a conclusion, I think that you see where I'm coming from. First of all, I think everyone will agree here that this sector is way too important to be left to the sole device of the market forces. That's my first conclusion. The second one is that we need a regulatory system that helps tightening things up, where virtuous GHSPs can be rewarded for their efforts and their diligence in good as well as in crisis times, and where people's skills are recognized and can be reused in case a contract is lost, for instance. The system should aim at creating a framework in which the sector is, let's say, incentivized to raise its general standard, and is disincentivized, if you will, to try to continue on the path towards the race to the bottom, which is unfortunately a little bit the path that we're now all following. Forcing the adoption of an SMS on all the ground handlers, irrespective of the country, of the station, or obviously of the continent, is, in my humble opinion, long overdue. Thank you, Fabio, and I'd be happy to take on any question that might arise. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Fabio, también por tu presentación. Muy interesante punto de vista desde la perspectiva de los ground handlers. Agradezco mucho tu intervención. A continuación, le voy a pedir a Thomas Romick, del Airports Council International, se prepara para dar la perspectiva por parte de los operadores de aeropuerto. Thomas.
Yes, hello, sorry, I just had to unmute myself. Fabio, can you see the slides?
We can see the slides and it's all set. Thank you, Thomas.
Perfecto, gracias. Good day to all. Buen día a todos. Thank you to ICAO to start with for inviting ACI, Airports Council International, to participate in this event and present some of the airport's views and perspectives on ground handling. We've heard a lot so far. I'll try and be brief because I think we're getting quite short on time. But we'll go into some of the airport side of the industry. My name is Thomas Romig. I'm Vice President, Safety, Security and Operations here in Montreal with ACI. I joined the organization in November last year in the midst of a pandemic. It's been a very interesting ride so far. Following 13 years in various leadership roles in safety and operations at Geneva Airport in Switzerland. But I've been involved in the aviation industry now for almost 20 years, about half of Andrew's time, who we heard from earlier. Well, with ACI actually previously, and so spending a lot of time being involved in the activities of ACI and subsequently ICAO for almost that entire period of time. Before I get started on my presentation about ground handling, just a couple of words on ACI. It's just to explain who we are and what we do. Airports Council International was founded in 1991. It represents the best interests of airports during, I'd say, key phases of policy development, and our main objective is to ensure that we have a global air transport system which is safe, secure, customer-centric, and environmentally sustainable. As of this year, 2021, we have 701 members who operate 1,933 airports in 183 countries. So now to come to the topic of the day, ground handling. We've heard a lot so far, and as we all know, and we've heard actually from some of the previous speakers, the airport is a complex environment in which a multitude of different stakeholders operate, and often in a fairly compressed space, time, and in often, unfortunately, still a lot of cost pressures around the industry. We heard this from some of the previous speakers too. This isn't really the best scenario in which we can ensure high levels of safety, both in terms of operations, as well as in terms of what we're providing in services on airports with the ground handling service providers. But I'd say more or less luckily, we've managed to make it so far. I think Fabio mentioned that too. There's been some good progress which has been made, and we've managed to sustain a good system so far. But we still have numerous safety events which are taking place, and this isn't obviously a good situation. We'll be hearing from IATA with some really interesting data in just a moment too, about the safety issues that we have in the ground handling domain. So in terms of ground handling, there's for airports, there's many challenges, and some of them are here on the slide. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'd just point out one of the key elements in my point of view is the relationship between the ground handling service provider and the airport operator and the aircraft operator. In some cases, the airport has a direct relationship with the ground handling service provider through some form of agreement, and we'd actually like to see more of that as airports. But in other cases, there's no or little formal relations established. On the other hand, the airport operator rarely has a formal relationship with the air operators. There's a lot of ad hoc coordination which takes place, but there isn't a formal relationship established, apart from in a few rare cases. But they always have an agreement in place with the GHSP. So by they, I mean the air operators. And these agreements will establish certain requirements, and in some cases, these requirements may diverge from those of the airport. So I hope you're still following, because as I said, it's a little bit complicated. However, as an airport operator, it's important to point out that one of our key requirements as part of the aerodrome certification on a state level, and through the application of safety management through our aerodrome safety management systems, we have a direct responsibility for ensuring an overall safe operating environment and overall safe operation, I would say, on the airport. And this includes, of course, apron operations, or what's going on in terms of ground handling under the wing to a certain extent. We're not talking about aircraft loading in other areas, which is very specific to what's touching the aircraft. But the challenge is now, how do we actually deal with this when we have a bit of a lack of standardization in terms of the operations which have been provided by the ground handling service providers? We have a lack of standardized requirements by the air operators. And so the ground handling service provider often doesn't really have a safety management system either in place. I know Fabio mentioned there are some really robust systems which have been developed, and I fully agree with that. But there is still a multitude of smaller ground handling service providers who don't have an obligation and don't have a safety management system in place. And again, there's no formal oversight mechanism from a state level. There are, of course, the air operator audits and various programs which exist in the industry, but these aren't standardized and these aren't applied across the industry in a systematic way either. And then we have the issue of variations to procedures. We have some very good industry recommended procedures, but air operators tend to still find a lot of ways to make variations to those, to that common baseline, we could call it. So again, it's a little bit complicated. And in my view, and I think we can all agree on that, a complicated situation doesn't really go very well with building safety overall. So the question then is, what is it that we need as airport operators to be able to ensure a safe operation? Well, from an airport's point of view, I'd say it's fairly simple in a complicated situation, and it's not actually really that simple. On one hand, airports would like to see formal agreements which are established with the ground handling service providers that will govern the relationships and the operating conditions of that ground handling service provider on the airport. And this needs to cover aspects such as the local safety procedures, which are defined by the airport operator, the airport operational requirements or conditions, elements such as coordination of safety management or engagement in the management of emergencies, part of the emergency response plan. But it can also include other areas such as I'd say maybe more practical elements like lease spaces for GSE or office rentals and so on. There's also a need to have a harmonized approach to the application of some of the core ground handling procedures. And we can think about some of the simplest ones that still very often diverge immensely depending on which air carrier is asking the ground handling service provider to apply them. And this still creates a level of complexity for the GHSPs, which obviously isn't conducive either for a good level of safety. So reduction of this level of complexity by having some simple harmonized operating procedures means that we will have over time an improvement in the level of safety. The implementation of safety management systems is of course something else that we need to be considering, and it was mentioned by some of the previous speakers. It's a piece of the work that we're doing as part of the ground handling task force. We need to have a common approach to safety monitoring and oversight, both on a state level, as well as in terms of what's done by the airport operator, in terms of what's done by the aircraft operator, depending on how that safety management coordination piece is put in place. And this, I'd say, is particularly important to ensure an appropriate level of safety monitoring of ground handling service provision, but also to avoid some of the duplication of effort which currently exists in the domain of safety monitoring. So these are some of the, let's say, considerations that we can have from an airport perspective. And thinking ahead a little bit, in addition to these areas, there's some other areas that we can look at, and they were mentioned. RC in his overview of the ground handling manual mentioned the apron design aspects, which we've included in the document, where airport operators need to consider the development or the configuration and layout of an apron when they're designing facilities, or when we're redeveloping areas of the apron, where we need to take into consideration aspects around, for example, the staging of GSE or operational maneuvers, the space needed for de-icing, the space needed for loading and unloading of aircraft, for bus operations and so on. These safety distances, of course, we have a land mass which is not necessarily expandable, but these safety distances and safety requirements are extremely important and not necessarily considered as part of the design criteria today in Annex 14. It's also important that airports and the local community of air operators and ground handling service providers work in a collaborative way to harmonize and to try and develop common operating models. This will ensure a safe operating environment and again reduce complexity across the airport system. It's important for us to also consider the operational efficiencies that can be brought out of a well-coordinated ground handling operation. And I know we're considering mainly safety, but it is also an aspect to take into consideration is the notion of coordination and efficiency in the ground handling domain, as this will also allow for good management of capacity and in the end, also improvements in terms of safety. So overall, despite all of these best efforts that we're taking, as we see on the image here, unfortunately, we still have an issue with safety, and we still have events which take place. And as I mentioned, we'll hear from some others. We've heard some good statistics so far, and we'll hear some more in just a moment on that. The 2020 impacts, so the pandemic was mentioned also by Fabio Gamba a moment ago, is also an issue that we need to be considering. And the question to me still remains on the level of risk that we're likely to see across the industry with this, let's say, evolving situation that we're going to have coming out of the pandemic. We're working from ACI's perspective on ensuring that good communication is maintained with airport operators to be able to move out of this situation in the best possible way, but there will be challenges ahead. I'd say that the good news, though, is that we're on the right trajectory when it comes to ground handling, at least, with the work which has been done by the ground handling task force so far, the development of the guidance materials, the developments of the SARPs, which are currently underway, which all in all are leading to a more globally harmonized process and approach, and in the end will ensure an overall enhanced level of safety. So these are some of the good things that we're doing, and just thinking ahead a little bit in terms of where some of the opportunities are. Across the industry, we see that we have a huge amount of data and a huge amount of information available, and sharing this data to better comprehend and analyze the issues that the industry is faced with will be an important way to be able to move forwards also collaboratively. And some of this work is currently underway as part of the ground handling task force. At the same time, addressing some of the issues around the harmonization of procedures. We've addressed this, we've talked about this, and it will be a continued effort which is needed, will improve the level of safety and of course reduce the level of complexity, and so the two are tied together. And finally, I would say that ensuring that all of these improvements and standardized approaches to safety monitoring and oversight on a state level, as well as through the implementation of safety management systems by the GHSPs, will be fundamental to ensuring a safe operating environment and a safe industry overall. So thank you for taking a few minutes to listen to what I had to say from an airport's perspective. Thank you again to ICAO South America region for the invitation to speak in this webinar. And I'll hand back to you, Fabio. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Tomás, por tu presentación y la perspectiva de ACI. Muy interesante también resaltar lo que también había comentado Arsi y que tú vuelves y comentas del diseño de las plataformas. Es un tema que yo antes de entrar a la OASI, que estaba en el operador de aeropuerto, era un reto acomodar a las necesidades de los ground handlers en espacios reducidos. O sea que sí es importante tomar en cuenta eso en ese camino que estás trazando. Muchas gracias, Tomás, nuevamente por tu presentación. A continuación, le voy a pedir a nuestros colegas de IATA que puedan compartir su perspectiva, la perspectiva de los operadores de aeronaves representados por esta organización. Vamos a tener presentación por parte de Joseph Suidan, Massimo Cisetti y Paul Fleming de IATA. No sé quién va primero, Paul o Massimo. Joseph, aquí está.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for giving us this opportunity. And I would like to sincerely thank Mr. Fabio Rabbani and the ICAO South American regional team for supporting and acknowledging the ground handling community And as mentioned by RC and Andrew, safety and efficiency are our top priority. And being one industry, we will definitely continue to be resilient and relevant. Let me assure you that safety starts on the ground. Having said, let me give you a quick brief on IATA, that we are an international air transport association that is a global trade of association representing the world's airline. Our member includes some 293 passenger and cargo airlines. And we do represent over 83% of the global air traffic. My name is Joseph Sweden, and I am the head of ground operation in IATA. And our presentation will go along together with the ASA and the ACI and the ICAO ground handling manual to present. As we are a global association, we do have a governance structure, and we do develop standards, policies by maintaining the second slide, Paul, please. We do develop standards, policies, and best practices by maintaining the safety and efficiency priority alongside with sustainable green operation. We do advocate on behalf of our industry with the aim to maintain sustainability all across the globe of our industry. Our governance structure includes job cards and work plan for our working group and task forces, and comprises of airlines, ground service providers, authorities, regulators, and manufacturers. From the working group, the IATA Ground Operation Working Group strongly recommends that you have listened from RC, from Andrew, from Fabio, and from Thomas. We really need that the industry need to adopt a common ground handling standards. We need to enable standardization, simplification, and a high level of safety to be achieved alongside the opportunity, and with the aim, as Andrew mentioned, to reduce cost and improve efficiency, as has been mentioned before. In doing so, the third slide, please, Paul. We lead in, as you see, the three manuals on there. It's that IATA leads the industry in developing those standards and policies and best practices based on the ICAO annexes and aligned with ACI and other industry documents also mentioned previously by the colleagues from the industry. As you can see on the IATA Ground Handling Manual, it's in edition 41, which is a yearly living manual with the latest and definitive source for the latest industry approved policies and standard covering all facts of safe and efficient airport operation. And it also includes the only recognized contract template called the Standard Ground Handling Agreement and the SLA that Fabio have mentioned and highlighted before. Alongside the IHM is the IGOM, the IATA Ground Operation Manual. It is on its 10th edition, and it's also a living manual based on a yearly basis. And this is a standardized ground handling processes and procedures with the aim to reduce the complexity and working with multiple airline, airports, and ground services providers. Processes and procedures in the IGOM have been developed based on industry best practices that generally provide an acceptable level of safety risk in the conduct of ground handling operation. Those two manuals includes the following industry guidance that can assist ground handlers during the pandemic, COVID-19, with the industry restart. And it includes a new chapter that is based on guidance for pandemic management. And the AHM also includes the ground support, equipment storage, and return to services. And the AGOM has been focusing on the cleaning and disinfection of aircraft guidance and materials, which is available on our website. And also in the AGOM, you would see a sequence of procedures for aircraft ground movement to ensure functions and processes are executed safely. And the third manual, it's an edition, is the ISAGO standard manual. It is on its 10th edition. It's another living manual, which Paul will be talking to us about the ISAGO later on. I will pass on now to Massimo to take us through the aircraft ground damage and its forecast and facility. Massimo, over to you.
Thank you, Joseph. So what I want to talk to you today is about, how much we spend in ground damage now as an industry. Now, what we have done in the last year and a half, we have done quite an extensive research starting from our ground damage database. It has been a program that IATA has launched in 2017 and has participated over 200 companies, not necessarily only airline operators, but also ground handlers who have supported us with a lot of data and information about ground damage. What we have done out of those instances of damage and damage rates, we have applied some studies and methodology on how to calculate essentially the cost of each damage, coming out to the conclusion that over 80% of the cost is about indirect cost, and only 20%, if not less, is direct cost, meaning the cost of repairs. So having done some research together with the industry stakeholders, all our groups, we have come to this cost model. And actually we have seen that almost we damage a rate of 4.8 per 10,000 flight, among 4.8 to 5.2 times per 1,000 flight. Damage rate is much higher in wide bodies so far than it is in narrow bodies. So just to go back to what Andrew Badham was mentioning at the very beginning, when we talk about how much is ground handling in terms of safety, well, let's see, maybe those are not all incidents that may affect the flight safety, but how much does it cost from the industry? As of today, we are around a figure of 5.7 billion mark. If you consider the traffic growth, now we have this problem with the pandemic that has slowed down the traffic, but we're projecting before the COVID a traffic growth in 15 years between 3.7 billion of passengers to 6.7 billion of passengers. So with that traffic growth, traffic movement increase, number of GSEUs increase, number of movement increase, and damage rate, if remain the same, will increase to figures that will reach 8.2 billion in mostly 15 years. I would say we are taking into consideration here a 4 for the restart. So that's quite a bunch and a lot of money, without even considering all the accidents that happened due to wrong ground handling. Some example in the last years, Bagram incident, wrong loading, wrong lashing, aircraft unable to take off and crashes. Other crashes that has been happened in other flights due to wrong loading or load control. So are we really say here that ground handling is not a safety issue? Well, actually it is a safety issue. Of course, there's a lot of things we can do to prevent those damages and those costs to happen. The ICAO model on first piece is something that we have delivered as a group, as an industry, to support states in implementing an oversight, an efficient oversight on the ground handling activity with some good recommendation. Ground damage is only a piece, but it's not the only one. Of course, good and simple ground operation processes and procedures, efficient training of people, and Fabio talked also about the issue of rotation, so retention in ground handling industry, which is another big problem to look at, which also is another important element to consider when we talk about safety. Now, if we go to the next slide, and then I will leave to Paul further consideration on what can be done in terms of SMS and what it is our program. Injuries. Yeah, we know that in ICAO, it is not considered, an accident when we have a fatality on the ramp of a person which has not the intention to fly. Nonetheless, here we have a huge cost, and that's depending a lot on what is the business model of the country. Some countries has more allocated resources into insurances. Other states provide a state program that supply a lot of costs when you have an injured employee that has to stay home. So those are, of course, when we talk about human life, we don't want necessarily here to bring to dollar figures. So without even including the fatality, without even including how much is from an ethical perspective, the occupational health and safety piece, here we're talking about figures about 2.1 billion, 2.2 billion yearly basis, just on costs that are split between the companies, the airline, the ground handlers, and the states. And those are something that we can absolutely do something better to implement better occupational health and safety policies. Now, in terms of overall figures, that's what I think it is the most important pieces. But given with the same pace that without enhancing equipment, without enhancing ground operation, without looking into training, we could eventually, improve a lot. Just by improving the equipment, that is the major cause of the incident of ground damage, we could eventually save 20% of the instances of damage. And we are talking about the figures of 2.7 billion of saving just by implementing new and more efficient technology on the equipment that damaged the aircraft. With that, we can go to the next slide. I will hand over to my colleague, Paul Fleming, to present some of the programs that we do in IATA to support and to enhance safety in ground handling. Over to you, Paul.
Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Fleming. I'm the head of ground ops audits in IATA, and it's my pleasure to talk to you today. I do apologize for my inability to manage Zoom. I may have been 46 years in aviation, but there's probably 46 minutes in Zoom, so I'm still learning, and I've got a lot to learn as well. But I hope you're all okay. It's my pleasure to give you some information on ISAGO, which is the IATA Safety Audit for Ground Operators. It's a program that's been in existence now since 2008, so we've got quite a lot of experience in this area. As usual, the program is based around pillars, and we have three: safety, effectiveness, and value. Safety obviously is the most important in everyone's eyes. And what we concentrate on is, and certainly is on the safety management system. We've had safety management system as a requirement, a standard within the audit program now since 2019. And so in that respect, we align fully with the intentions of the ICAO ground handling manual to elevate safety management or implement safety management in ground operations. And also as a contribution to a state safety program as well. It doesn't just stop at the operator or the provider. We have evidence that ISAGO registration, having successfully done an audit, improves safety levels. Data shows that an ISAGO registered ground service provider is 70% more likely to report a safety event. And if that safety event did take place, then the damage will be less severe. That's what our data shows. And so we're rather proud of that. We not only do improve safety, but we reduce ground damage, which you've just seen is a major driver for this initiative. We also capture personnel safety now, particularly because the ICAO manual has brought that to our attention. And so we now have, as part of our recommended practices, introduced this year, assessments of the provisions in place, the procedures in place, the process in place to protect personnel. In terms of effectiveness, we are obviously in line with other programs in IATA to ensure that we standardize as much as possible. We use the IGOM as the basis of our recommended practices for the procedures that are in use in ground operations. In addition, we support management and risk management of outsourced services by airlines, feeding into the IOSA program. ISAGO is recognized as an acceptable means of compliance for the oversight of the safety of ground operations that are outsourced. We hope that the use of ISAGO can reduce the number of duplicate audits, the many audits done of ground operations by airlines as part of their oversight obligations. The ISAGO report one ISAGO audit report can eliminate a number of airline audits that are covering the same scope. We are a truly global business. The next slide, I'll show you exactly what our footprint is. And what's more, we didn't just stop at the station or the ground operations. We do our assessment of the organization, the ground service provider as an organization from its headquarters and across all its network of stations, wherever it operates. The value comes in the fact that we produce high quality audit reports. We tell it like it is. We've developed these audit reports on the basis of standards and the assessment of standards that are developed by industry. We have a group of industry experts that help us develop these standards and maintain their relevance. Of course, we cannot exclude the issue of insurance. We know that insurance is a big issue nowadays with costs of ground damage. We cannot guarantee that you'll get a decrease in your premiums, but what we can do is we can help you decrease your risk profile. That can maybe help you reduce those insurance costs. Once again, I'd like to stress that we are a global presence, and I think that this is something that I need to come back to in a little while. IATA doesn't claim to be the one to go to or to have global dominance in this area. But what we do have is a lot of experience, and we do say that we are an industry alternative to state regulation. We are there to help. We can assist states to achieve the aims of the ICAO Ground Handling Manual. That's our aim, to do that, because trust me, I've been in this game now for about 3 or 4 years, and in those 3 or 4 years, I've learned a lot, and I've learned that ground handling is not an easy subject to deal with, as our previous speakers have said. In terms of global footprint, this is where we are. The green dots means that we've done audits. I've highlighted there the South American region, so you can see how we fare in your part of the world. Overall, though, we have over 230 ground service providers that are registered in ISAGO, covering 304 stations around the world at 204 airports. Now, we are in this business in a big way. We have a lot of experience. This registry is used by airlines. Airlines can get access to their audit reports, which they can then use in their risk management systems. In terms of numbers, obviously last year hit us hard, but not as hard as we were expecting. We managed to do over half the audits that we had scheduled, 104 in total. Nearly half of those were remote. We had to adapt to the situation, the fact that we couldn't travel. Our auditors couldn't get to the destination, so we did remote audits. There's a knock-on effect, of course, that those audits that didn't take place last year will take place this year. So we've got a bumper year. We've got a big number of audits to cover this year, nearly 380 we expect this year. Still, a lot of them will be remote because we still have travel restrictions, but where we can do an on-site audit, we will. Importantly, though, despite the pandemic, despite the number of audits that we weren't able to do, we've still managed to get new audit reports into the system. We've managed to cover quite a bit of ground in 2019 and 2020, and we have now over 550 audit reports available to airlines around the world. My last slide is just to give you some experiences. As I said earlier, the ground handling world, and others have said it too, is very complex. And when it comes to oversight, it's just as much complexity as anywhere else you'll find in the aviation world. We have taken a long time in IATA to develop the standards and operational procedures. It takes a lot of effort to do that, and then it takes a lot of effort to maintain it as well. I think I can safely say that we are alone in this area in having these standards and procedures. Nowhere else will you find them, and to develop them from scratch will take a lot of time and effort. Also remember that ground operations isn't just loading and unloading aircraft. There are far, far, far more types of operation and diverse operations to cover in your operations. Ground service providers, you can have quite a few. 211 in Brazil, I heard. Not all 211 at one airport, but you can have many, many at the same airport, on the same ramp, on the same stand at the same time, all trying to do their job. They have to work together. They have to work to the same standards or same procedures, or at least have some coordination. We find as well that business models are changing, not just due to COVID, but also because of different business arrangements. We heard earlier that airlines are no longer doing self-handling, they're outsourcing. We're finding now there's a trend towards outsourcing, that you can have a ground service provider that doesn't actually do the job. All they do is handle the agents or the outsourced agencies that do the job. It's becoming very complex. Plus, they are international, truly international. They may have their headquarters in one country, but they're spread around the world. And that means that they have different operating requirements around the world too. It's not all one size fits all. And then lastly, frequent change. It's just like hotels. You go to Meridian one day, the next week it will be a Hilton, and the week after that it'll be a Holiday Inn. They change their names, their operating conditions, and their contracts frequently. These are just some of the challenges and opportunities that you will face in the world of ground handling. I'm sure it's not news to you, but in ISAGO, we have had to experience this over the last 10, 12, 13 years, and we're still experiencing it today, and it's still changing. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. And I'd also like to thank the interpreters as well, because I'm sure they're longing to get over this webinar. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Muchas gracias, Paul, y a los colegas de IATA por su interesante presentación. Ciertamente estos programas que han existido durante algún tiempo han ayudado efectivamente a mantener unas plataformas más seguras. Por último, queríamos pedirle a Terry Jomans de IBAC para que realice su presentación. Esta interesante presentación, les pido que se mantengan para escucharla, a pesar de que hemos pasado un poco el tiempo, dado que es un segmento de la aviación que se ve muy impactado con problemas de ground handling y que consideramos muy interesante escuchar. Terry, es todo tuyo. Adelante, gracias.
Okay, thank you everybody and good day. And I know that I'm in between you and either lunch or dinner, so I apologize for that. I'm very used to going last, so just bear with me. So thank you very much for the invite from ICAO South America region. For those of you who don't know who IBAC is, we're the International Business Aviation Council. We are headquartered in the Montreal ICAO building. I'd like to say that we have a penthouse suite, but we do have an office on the top floor of the ICAO building in Montreal. I myself am based in the UK. I've been in business aviation and in aviation since 1984, so I'm pushing on where Andrew is, but all of my time has been with business aviation. So we are different. It's a different world in the FBO, ground handling service providers. And I'd just like to give an introduction into the programs and where we are from our side of things. So our members, as IBAC, we're the International Business Aviation Council. We have 15 member associations in global reach. In the South America region, we have ABAGI, based in Brazil. Brazil are a big business aviation user and manufacturer, and very important to our organization. So we really appreciate their input. In terms of organizations that are represented by our member associations, and therefore from our point of view, we are looking at in the region of 15,000 individual small, medium enterprises operating on a global level. So it's a significant amount of aircraft operators and service providers supporting the business and general aviation industry. When we've been looking at safety management and trying to promote safety management within the safety management panel and other work teams, workforces that we work with within ICAO, we're asked to say, where's the risk? And it's very, very difficult to come up with a good visual depiction of what the risk is. But the best one that is out there that shows the risk of ground damage is the current EASA, the European Union Aviation Safety Agency annual safety report for the last 2 years has indicated that ground damage is showing the number of risk score occurrences and the higher risk categorized scores. It's a significant issue, which is why Europe in particular are really pushing on this issue of controlling and looking after how we can better manage ground handling damage and safety. And where's the data is the next question we get. So we've been capturing data now for the last 5 years because the data isn't readily available. We've heard about insurance companies trying to help out, but you know, insurers are saying they won't give the information out. So we've been trying to capture stuff ourselves, and we've got 1,130 incidents over the last 5 years. 70% of those have resulted in aircraft damage. So we know that this is all high level stuff. We need to get the near miss and the smaller, lower risk incidents in out there, because that 70% is too high to be a good, valuable data stream, but it's what we have. But we also know that 28% of that data, the aircraft came into contact with GSE. Either an aircraft has hit some GSE or a GSE has hit an aircraft. We know that 43% of the incidents occurred where the aircraft was not under its own power. So that's in fact where the aircraft is in turnaround, or it's being moved by an FBO or a ground handling service provider during that turnaround process or during that parked procedure. And we know that towing is a significant causal factor from the data that we have. So we need to address that in our standards and in our training as well. And we've heard the discussions from everybody today about the differences in handling, and we are different. We are a different sector. So when you're talking about complex and non-complex operations, these are typical general aviation ramps, business aviation ramps. And in my past life, I worked for an FBO. I worked for a very successful FBO over here in the UK. And from one day to the next, I could be handling a Cessna 172 on one day, and then later on that afternoon, I could be looking after a corporate business aviation 747-400 series. So lots of different types of aircraft, lots of different types of operations, ramps that are very, very complex. As you can see on these ramps here, there are no parking instructions. They're effectively open hangars. Space on an apron is on an airport is very, very premium. So we have to make the best use of it. So lots of aircraft, lots of different aircraft. So when we're talking about the regulations saying, well, business aviation or general aviation is non-complex, it's simple. It's not simple. It can be complex, but it can be simple. So one size doesn't fit all. So the standards that we operate from the International Standard for Business Aircraft Handling is not a competing standard to ISAGO, it's a complementary standard. They run alongside each other. One is for the airlines, and one is for our sector. And what everybody has to realize is that business aviation and general aviation aircraft can be commercial operations, they can be non-commercial operations, and they can be helicopter operations as well. So we cover under Annex 6 parts 1, 2, and 3, those GA operations can be taken place at a ramp, at an FBO from one day to the next. And we work in mixed environments. It's not just general aviation airports we operate to the major hubs. And the reason I've got this particular photo here is it's what we use in our training in one of our workshops, is that this is a G650, a Gulfstream 650. It's a business jet. The wingspan of this is very, very similar to a 737-800 series aircraft. It's a significantly large aircraft. But where airports are training their staff in a mixed environment to look for anti-collision beacons, what we try and explain to people is that the anti-collision beacon on this aircraft is actually invisible during the day from this angle, because there is one anti-collision beacon that is buried at the bottom of the aircraft, and it's hidden behind the skid underneath the aircraft, so you can't see it. So when your FBO staff are being trained, and when your airport staff are being trained to look for anti-collision beacons, if you're in a mixed airport environment, that may be a problem. So training has to cover every eventuality for the different mixed environments you get on an airport. And interface management. This is something that's been brought up. We've talked about the earlier on with the OEM information, getting good information. So this is a TBM 700 aircraft. It's a single turboprop aircraft. Some operations are commercial with these aircraft, some are non-commercial, but the starting system in the OEM does allow for a ground power unit start. So what I wanted you to do is just look at this video very, very quickly. I'm going to rush through some of it in the expedience of time, but this is somebody fitting a ground power unit to this aircraft. And here we have the engine starting. And here we now have the engine up to full power. Now, of course, somebody now has to enter that danger zone. Look how close it is to the exhaust. Look how close it is to the propeller. To remove that equipment, close the door and step away from it. So we need to understand now that what's happening is that air crews and operators are actually asking ground handlers to do things that is actually risking the ground staff in an airport environment. And that's something we want to make available and aware to everybody. So this is all about a total management system. It's about looking after everybody in an airside environment, whether it's a small aircraft, whether it's a big aircraft, whether it's operating commercially or non-commercially. There are standards and services that are out there for everybody that need to be addressed. So single solution may not be possible. One size does not fit all. And in the document 10.121, the manual on ground handling, we identify that. We've been involved with the ground handling task force since its inception in 2014. And we also want to make sure that SMS is adapted and adopted by ground handling service providers. That includes the FBO world, that includes the business aviation world. We're very lucky that we've had a significant uptake of interest from our industry to uptake and taken on SMS on a voluntary basis. So we want to get Annex 19 to adopt and uptake ground handling into it. That is our aim. Talking back data, very quickly going back, I know I'm just running over now my allotted time, but just very, very quickly, I want to go over where the incidents are. So we have one insurance company that's given us some very good, accurate data over the last 18 years. This is specifically from our sector, from the business aviation sector. We came in as the ISBAR, we launched our standard in 2014, which is around about year 13 here on this list. You can see that the claims started going up, the average cost per claim going up there. By the time we started getting our first stage 1 registrations and then started our stage 2 registrations a year later, we can start to see that average cost per claim dropping. So just like Ayata was saying, we can see there is a correlation between the uptake in these voluntary standards from our sector, and I'm sure Ayata sees it from theirs as well, with the downturn in average cost per claim. So we hope that we're having a difference. Still very, very early days, but we're looking at the information and keeping track of it. In terms of our point of view from our sector, this is the split where we have over just over 245 registrations that have met our stage 1. We have a 3-stage maturity level with our standards. 245 locations have done it at stage 1. We've got 148 of those globally at stage 2 and 7 at stage 3, which is an embedded safety culture within the organization. And this is the split. And you will see here that South America, we've got work to do in South America. So we want to see the South America region uptake. We want to see what we can do to help the South America region improve the uptake of industry standards, whether that be for the airline side, for IATA, or from our side, from the ISBAR. We would like to see an uptake in industry standards and the use of industry standards to help reduce airside incidents. So thank you for your time. It's been a great opportunity to present our program here. If anybody has any questions, my contact details are here. We have regular workshops that we run on our programs, and we have since day 1 opened an invitation to any of the regulatory authority out there that would like to attend our workshops. Just drop us a line and we can get you registered onto our workshops at no cost. So we want you to understand what our program is about so that we can help you make aviation safer. So thank you.
Muchas gracias, Terry, por tu presentación, y indicando lo que dijo Terry, también exhortamos a los estados que quieran participar en estos eventos que organiza IBAC, ya sea directamente al correo de Terry o al correo de la oficina regional. Con gusto nosotros le podemos pasar la información. Con esta interesante presentación de IBAC, llegamos al punto final de nuestro webinar. Dado que nos hemos pasado un poco de tiempo, hemos podido contestar algunas de las preguntas que hemos recibido en la sección de preguntas y respuestas. Y aquellas que no podamos responder en este momento por factor de tiempo, vamos a tomar nota de ellas para, como indicamos, incluirlas en un documento en nuestro portal, del evento. Quisiera aprovechar esta oportunidad para agradecer a todos los expositores de las organizaciones que nos acompañaron en este evento. También agradecer al apoyo logístico tanto de las intérpretes como de las asistentes en la oficina regional que pudieron llevar a cabo este evento. Y a ustedes por participar y acompañarnos durante esta sesión. Nuevamente invitarles a explorar el documento, a informarse acerca de estos aspectos y por qué no trabajar juntos para la implementación del SMS a nivel de los proveedores de servicios a escala y su interrelación con el resto de los SMS de los operadores de aeronaves, aeródromos y otros. Con esto vamos a finalizar la sesión. Muchas gracias y hasta pronto.